Dublin, 1868. A May morning. A funeral procession moves through the streets of the Liberties, slow and solemn, flanked by thousands of mourners who have come to pay their respects to the wealthiest man in Ireland. Sir Benjamin Lee Guinness is dead at 69. The coffin passes the gates of St. James's Gate Brewery, his cathedral, his kingdom. The crowd is vast but respectful. Contemporary accounts describe a dignified, almost reverent affair. No riots, no political disturbance, no confrontation between nationalists and loyalists, just a city saying goodbye to the man whose name was on its most famous product and whose money had reshaped its streets. If you have watched the Netflix series House of Guinness, you will recognize this moment, or rather, you will recognize a version of it that never happened. The show opens with Fenian rioters storming Benjamin's funeral, overturning the procession, setting Dublin ablaze with political fury. It makes for spectacular television, and it is also completely invented. The Fenians had gone underground in 1867 and were not a visibly active force by the time Benjamin died. The real funeral was quiet, the real grief was genuine, and the real story of what happened next, the fracture of a dynasty, the remaking of an entire city, the entanglement of beer and empire and philanthropy and social control, is far stranger and more unsettling than anything Stephen Knight put on screen. This is the true story of the house that Guinness built. If these deep investigations into the families and empires behind Britain and Ireland's greatest landmarks are worth your time, please subscribe to this channel, leave a comment telling me which dynasty we should investigate next, and help these stories find the audience they deserve. It begins not with death, but with audacity. Arthur Guinness was born in 1725 in Selbridge, County Kildare. The son of Richard Guinness, land steward to the Reverend Arthur Price, Archbishop of Cashel. Richard brewed beer for workers on the Archbishop's estate, and it was here, amid the barley fields and the limestone water of Kildare, that young Arthur learned the craft that would make his name immortal. When the Archbishop died in 1752, he left £100 each to Richard and Arthur. That was equivalent to 4 years' wages, a fortune by the standards of rural Ireland. Arthur used it wisely. He established a small brewery in the town of Leixlip, mastered his trade, and then, in 1759, made the decision that would change the history of Dublin, of Ireland, and of beer itself. He moved to the capital. The country was in financial crisis. The 7 Years' War had collapsed banks and cratered property values, and across Dublin, buildings stood empty and businesses lay abandoned. Among them was a disused brewery at St. James's Gate, on the western edge of the city. 4 acres of land containing a brewhouse, a gristmill, 2 malt houses, and stabling for 12 horses. It had been empty for 9 years. On the last day of December, 1759, Arthur Guinness signed a lease for this property from the Rainsford family. The terms were extraordinary. £100 down, £45 per year in rent, and the duration of the lease was 9,000 years. 9,000. The document still exists. It is displayed under glass on the ground floor of the Guinness storehouse, and visitors pause to stare at it the way they might stare at a relic in a cathedral, which in a sense it is. A founding document of faith. Faith that a 34-year-old brewer from Kildare could build something on 4 acres of abandoned ground that would outlast entire civilizations. And he was right. 266 years later, Guinness is still brewed at St. James's Gate. The lease itself is no longer valid. The brewery grew so vast that the company eventually bought the land outright. But the audacity of the original agreement has become inseparable from the mythology. Arthur Guinness signed a contract with the future, and against all probability, the future honoured it. Arthur did not begin with stout. He brewed ale, as most Irish brewers did, competing in a market dominated by English imports. In the 1770s, a new kind of beer was sweeping through London. A dark, rich, durable brew called porter, named for the dockworkers and market porters who drank it in enormous quantities. Porter was cheap, satisfying, and strong enough to survive long sea voyages without spoiling. It was also, crucially, not Irish. London brewers like Whitbread and Barclay Perkins controlled 80% of the porter sold in Dublin. And Arthur Guinness saw in this foreign domination an opportunity. He began brewing porter in 1778. By 1799, he had stopped producing ale entirely. The gamble was absolute. He was staking his brewery, his family, and his 9,000-year lease on a single product. Dark beer brewed with roasted barley, hopped heavily, aged in enormous wooden vats that lined the brewery walls like sleeping giants. The colour was almost black. The taste was bitter and complex. The head settled like cream. And the Dublin market, accustomed to pale English imports, took to it with a loyalty that would last centuries. But success at St James's Gate was never simply a matter of good beer. It was a matter of water and power and the willingness to fight for both. The terms of Arthur's lease granted him access to a supply of water from the city's pipes, drawn from the Poddle River, essential for brewing, essentially free. When the Dublin Corporation decided to cut off and fill in the watercourse, claiming that Arthur was exceeding the terms of his agreement, he did not negotiate. He did not petition. According to contemporary accounts, Arthur Guinness violently rushed upon the corporation's workers, wrenching a pickaxe from one of them and declaring, with what the records describe delicately as very much improper language, that they should not proceed. The water stayed on. The corporation backed down. The porter flowed. By the time Arthur died in 1803, at the age of 78, the brewery was thriving. He left behind 10 surviving children from a marriage that produced 21. A staggering number, even by the standards of the age, a growing business that dominated the Dublin porter market, and a reputation as both a shrewd commercial operator and a genuine philanthropist. He had co-founded Dublin's first Sunday school, served as governor of the Meath Hospital, and argued publicly for Catholic rights while remaining a committed Protestant. The contradictions were already in place: generosity and self-interest, Irish identity and imperial ambition, faith and commerce. The family would spend the next 2 centuries trying to reconcile them. Arthur's son, Arthur Guinness II, inherited the brewery and expanded it with methodical precision. But it was the 3rd generation that transformed Guinness from a successful Dublin brewery into something approaching a national institution. Benjamin Lee Guinness, Arthur's grandson, took sole control of the business in 1839 and drove it with relentless energy. Under his management, St James's Gate became the largest brewery in Ireland by 1838, and by the time of his death in 1868, the site had grown from 4 acres to 64. A vast industrial complex of vat houses, cooperages, maltings, and an internal railway system. The brewery was worth over £1 million. Benjamin was Ireland's first millionaire. The Netflix series portrays him as a cold patriarch, a Logan Roy figure, accused of letting tenants starve during the famine and of cutting his children from his affections as readily as he cut competitors from the market. Molly Guinness, Benjamin's great-great-great-granddaughter, has called this portrayal very unfair. Writing in the Times after the show aired, she described a man who was, in reality, a loving father and an almost compulsively generous philanthropist. Edward Guinness, the 4th Earl of Iveagh, who has pored over family papers and the archives in the Guinness storehouse for his own book, has said that while the Netflix series is a good attempt with beautiful photography, it makes no pretense of relating purely to fact. He observed that the four siblings are emphasized much more than they were in real life. The real Benjamin did not merely accumulate wealth. He spent it, strategically, visibly, with an eye on legacy that his grandfather would have recognized. From 1860 to 1865, he undertook at his own expense, and without hiring an architect, the full restoration of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Dublin's great medieval church had fallen into dangerous disrepair. The roof leaked, the walls crumbled. The nave that Jonathan Swift had once walked was rotting from within. Benjamin poured £150,000 into the project, directing the work personally, replacing stonework, rebuilding walls, restoring the building to something approaching its original grandeur. The gesture was enormous and enormously calculated. A Protestant brewer restoring a Protestant cathedral in a predominantly Catholic city at a time when Catholic emancipation was still a living memory, and the relationship between Ireland's Protestant ascendancy and its Catholic majority was the central tension of Irish political life. Benjamin was declaring that the Guinness family was not merely rich, it was essential. It was woven into the fabric of Dublin's identity, its spiritual architecture, its civic life, its economic survival in a way that could not be unpicked without unravelling the city itself. In 1862, he purchased two Georgian houses at numbers 80 and 81 St. Stephen's Green, combined them, refaced the building in Portland stone, and created Iveagh House, a private palace in the heart of Dublin with a ballroom lined in alabaster and ceilings painted in Wedgwood blue. He was elected Lord Mayor of Dublin in 1851, Conservative Member of Parliament for Dublin City in 1865, and was made a baronet in 1867. A year later, he was dead, and the empire he had built was about to fracture, though not in the way the television version tells it. Benjamin's will divided his empire among four children. Arthur, born in 1840, was the eldest son. Edward, born in 1847, was the youngest. Anne, born in 1839, was the only daughter. And Benjamin II was the middle son. Arthur and Edward were given joint stewardship of the brewery. The show claims the will threatened disinheritance if either brother left the company. That is fiction. In reality, Benjamin made it as difficult as possible to break the partnership, but the brothers retained the option to buy out the other's half, which is precisely what happened. The show also suggests that Anne and Benjamin Jr. were left with nothing. Also fiction. Anne was financially provided for through her dowry, as was standard for women of her class. Benjamin Jr. received fewer shares than his brothers, which stung, but he was not cast out. The people behind the Netflix performances were considerably more complicated than the screen versions suggest. Take Arthur. The show portrays him as a closeted gay man trapped in a loveless marriage with his wife Olivia. It is a compelling dramatic choice, and one that Jack Guinness, a gay descendant, publicly praised for refusing to continue the straightwashing of history. But the historian Adrian Tinniswood, author of The Houses of Guinness, has pointed out there is no evidence Arthur was homosexual. Tinniswood believes the writer Stephen Knight confused two different Arthurs. An uncle of the same name was surrounded by scandals and had what contemporaries called a marriage blanc. The Arthur who inherited the brewery is a different man entirely. The real Arthur was politically ambitious, socially polished, and drawn to the world of Westminster and the Anglo-Irish aristocracy. He ran for Parliament in Dublin in 1868, won his seat, and then lost it in spectacular fashion when an opponent brought a court case that revealed extraordinary levels of voter bribery, £5 a vote, dispensed by agents whose dirty tricks, as one historian wrote, would leave the most Machiavellian modern party manager in awe. Arthur claimed total ignorance of the scheme. he was found not personally responsible, but was nevertheless booted from Parliament after a single year. Whether he turned a blind eye to what his agents were doing, or was genuinely oblivious remains, as Professor Tinniswood puts it, hard to say. Election bribery was widespread at the time, and Arthur was neither the first nor the last Irish politicians to benefit from purchased loyalty. That scandal, real, documented, and damning, is more interesting than any fictional secret love affair. The show does depict it, to its credit. Then there is Anne. The show gives her a hidden lover and a complicated romantic life. The real Anne married William Plunkett, a Church of Ireland clergyman who became Baron Plunkett. She founded St. Patrick's Nursing Home in 1876 as a training school for Protestant nurses serving the poor of Dublin. She organised Bible reading groups. She was, by all accounts, a woman of deep religious conviction and practical charity. She died in 1889 at the age of 50, not exactly the character Netflix imagined. And Edward, perhaps the most consequential Guinness of all, the show gives him a secret nationalist lover from the Dublin docks, a woman who embodies the class tensions the show wants to explore. It makes for riveting drama. It is also fabricated. Edward married Adelaide Guinness, a cousin from a different branch of the family, and by all accounts the marriage was genuinely and deeply affectionate. When Adelaide died, she died in her husband's arms. Her bedroom at Elvedon Hall, their estate in Suffolk, was left untouched for the rest of Edward's life. The flowers that had stood at her bedside at the moment of her passing were never removed. That detail, recorded in family papers, is worth 100 fictional love triangles. By 1876, Arthur had sold his share of the brewery to Edward, severing the partnership their father had so carefully constructed. Arthur took his money and bought St. Stephen's Green. At the time, it was a private park reserved for the wealthy. He landscaped it at his own expense and gave it to the people of Dublin. He became Baron Ardelein. He lived grandly, gave generously, and died in 1915 without children. His title died with him. Edward took the brewery and made it immortal. In 1886, he floated Guinness on the London Stock Exchange, selling 65% of the business for £6 million. The sum made him one of the richest men in the British Empire overnight. The share offering was oversubscribed, and London's financial establishment fell over itself to buy a piece of Dublin's dark gold. Edward was created Baron Iveagh in 1891, and eventually Earl of Iveagh in 1919, accumulating titles as methodically as he accumulated capital. When he died in 1927, his estate was valued at £13 million. That figure was so vast that it has been estimated, accounting for the growth of the economy rather than simple inflation, at something approaching £1 billion in today's terms. He was, by any measure, one of the wealthiest men who had ever lived. The Netflix show invents an elaborate subplot about a character called Byron Hedges, played by Jack Gleeson, Joffrey from Game of Thrones, who is sent to America to broker a deal with the Fenian Brotherhood, promising them 15% of Guinness profits from American sales in exchange for Irish-American support. It is a brilliant piece of storytelling. It also has no basis in historical fact whatsoever. Byron Hedges never existed. The Fenian Brotherhood had no commercial relationship with Guinness, and America was not even a significant market focus in the 1860s. The brewery's expansion was aimed squarely at Britain and the colonies of the empire. Professor Tinniswood called the idea of America being a possible market at this time a great surprise. The real market that made Guinness global was not New York or Boston. It was the British Empire. The first recorded shipment of Guinness to the African continent arrived in Sierra Leone in 1827. West India Porter, the strongest Guinness blend, was brewed specifically to survive long sea voyages to colonial markets. By the 1890s, Guinness was being exported to the Caribbean, to West Africa, to Australia, to India. Anywhere the Union Jack flew, and British soldiers, administrators, and settlers were thirsty. The Empire drank Guinness because Guinness followed the Empire. And that is a far more uncomfortable truth than any fictional Fenian deal. Edward Cecil Guinness did not merely give money away. He built systems. In 1889, he established the Guinness Trust with an initial donation of £250,000, nearly 33 million in today's money. His explicit instructions were that the funds be used for the erection of dwellings for the labouring poor in London and Dublin. He later added another £367,000, bringing his total contribution to more than £80 million in modern terms. The Netflix show depicts every act of philanthropy as either shame-driven or self-serving. Donations made to atone for exploitation. Charity as public relations. Molly Guinness has pushed back sharply on this framing, and the historical record supports her. The philanthropy was vast, sustained, and detailed in a way that goes far beyond reputation management. Edward funded Shackleton's Antarctic expedition. He donated to research into infectious diseases. He endowed Trinity College Dublin, of which he served as Chancellor. In London, the Guinness Trust built social housing across the city. In Chelsea, Lambeth, Bethnal Green, Finsbury, Bermondsey, and Hammersmith. Blocks of flats that gave working families a standard of living that the private rental market would not provide for another half-century. In Dublin, the Trust concentrated its efforts on the Liberties, the neighbourhood surrounding St James's Gate, which by the late 19th century contained some of the worst slums in Europe. The streets around St Patrick's Cathedral, the very building Benjamin had so lovingly restored, were rife with poverty, disease, overcrowding, and prostitution. Families lived 8 to 10 to a room in crumbling Georgian tenements that had once housed the Anglo-Irish gentry. Cholera and typhoid moved through the district like weather. Edward demolished the tenements and built a complex of red brick apartment buildings, bathhouses, a market hall, a hostel, and a play centre. These were the Iveagh Trust buildings, completed between 1901 and 1915. The Iveagh Baths on Kevin Street offered the poor of Dublin clean hot water. The Iveagh Market on Francis Street provided covered stalls for traders. The hostel gave beds to single men who would otherwise have slept in doorways. Today, over a century later, the Iveagh Trust still provides more than 10% of the social housing in central Dublin. The buildings stand solid and red and functional in the shadow of the cathedral that Benjamin restored. They are monuments to a kind of philanthropy that was simultaneously genuine and strategic. Because a healthy workforce was a productive workforce, and the Guinness brewery depended on the Liberties for its labour as surely as the Liberties depended on the brewery for its survival. The relationship was symbiotic, and it was unequal. Edward knew this, but he also knew that the alternative, the unregulated squalor that had killed thousands, served no one's interests. Inside the brewery itself, conditions were better than almost anywhere else in Dublin, and this is perhaps the single most important aspect of the Guinness story that the Netflix series fails to explore. The show is fascinated by family rivalries, romantic betrayals, and political conspiracies. But the real engine of the Guinness empire was not drama, it was dependency. The brewery paid wages 10% above the industrial average. By 1870, the company had established a medical centre providing free healthcare not just to employees but to their entire families. Pensions were introduced in the 1880s, decades before such provisions became common in British or Irish industry. Employees receive free meals, an annual beer allowance, a daily pint from the brewery's tap bar for every worker over 21, paid holidays, and access to cooperative stores where clothing and household goods could be purchased at reduced rates. If an employee died before retirement, his spouse or next of kin received the pension. Depending on circumstances, the widow was often employed by the brewery as a cleaner or waitress. The brewery owned streets of housing for its employees in the Liberties at Bellevue and Thomas Court, adjacent to St James's Gate. It ran its own fire brigade, its own cooperage, its own internal narrow gauge railway. It operated barges on the Liffey to transport stout to the docks. It employed coopers who built wooden casks by hand. A skilled trade passed from father to son, a craft that sustained families for generations until the last wooden keg was racked in 1963. By 1930, the brewery was printing 1.8 million labels a day, enough, if laid end to end over a year, to circumnavigate the earth. By 1906, more than 3,200 people worked at St James's Gate, and an estimated 10,000, one in every 30 Dubliners, depended directly on the brewery for their livelihood. Many workers entered the brewery at the age of 14 and stayed until retirement at 65. Their personnel records, over 20,000 individual files, are preserved in the Guinness archive, documenting entire lives lived inside those walls. The phrase that circulated among the families of the Liberties was simple and telling. Guinness looked after you from the womb to the tomb. But there was a price. Loyalty was expected. Dissent was not encouraged. Paternalism was real, but so was the control. Guinness workers were the best treated labourers in Ireland, and they knew it, and they were grateful. And their gratitude was itself a form of management. The invisible hand that fed them also held them. This is what the Netflix show cannot quite bring itself to explore. Not the melodrama of family rivalry, but the quieter, more uncomfortable truth that an entire city was held in a kind of velvet dependency by a single family and a single product. In 1939, Iveagh House, the mansion Benjamin had built on St Stephen's Green, was donated to the Irish state by Edward's son Rupert, the second Earl of Iveagh. The ballroom alone had been constructed specifically to host a royal visit, at a cost of £30,000 for a single room. Rupert was an old Etonian and renowned oarsman, Chancellor of Trinity College Dublin, chairman of the family brewing business, and a man who understood better than most that the world in which Anglo-Irish aristocrats maintained private palaces in the heart of Dublin was already gone. The Irish Free State had become a republic. The Protestant ascendancy was dissolving. Rupert was not giving up power. He was acknowledging its transfer. The contents of Iveagh House were auctioned over 9 extraordinary days that September, as the Second World War began across Europe. 27,000 people passed through the house during the viewing and sale. Furniture from the time of Louis XVI went for £30. Copper boilers fetched 4 guineas. The ballroom that had hosted some of the grandest parties in Dublin's history was emptied lot by lot into the hands of dealers and collectors and ordinary Dubliners who walked in off the street to touch, for a moment, the fabric of a world that was vanishing. The Irish Times reported that the crowd were in a happy mood and that no word of war could be heard in the stately halls. Iveagh House became the headquarters of the Department of Foreign Affairs. Its wedgwood blue ceilings and alabaster staircases now serve a republic that did not exist when Benjamin Guinness designed them. The Iveagh Gardens behind the house were given to the city as a public park, with the stipulation that they remain unbuilt upon. A lung for Dublin, tucked behind the National Concert Hall, it is still one of the city's most peaceful and least known green spaces. The family retained Farmley, their estate in the Phoenix Park, until 1999, when the 4th Earl of Iveagh sold it to the Irish state. It is now a government guest house, hosting visiting heads of state in rooms that still carry the imprint of Guinness taste. They also owned Elvedon Hall in Suffolk, purchased by Edward from the Maharaja Duleep Singh, a figure of extraordinary colonial complexity. Edward rebuilt it on a scale that rivaled the greatest English country houses, with an Indian hall of opulent excess. The Guinness family, for all their Dublin roots, had become thoroughly British. Earl of Iveagh, Baron Ardilone, seats in the House of Lords, buried in Suffolk, not in Dublin. The brewery continued, the stout continued, but the family's direct control was slipping. In 1986, the company was rocked by a share trading scandal that saw the chairman, Ernest Saunders, convicted of fraud, a sordid chapter of financial manipulation that seemed to belong to a different universe from Benjamin's cathedral restoration and Edward's model housing. In 1997, Guinness merged with Grand Metropolitan to form Diageo, a British multinational drinks corporation. The name remained on the label, but the Guinness who signed the 9,000-year lease would not have recognised what his brewery had become. A brand in a portfolio, managed by executives who had never stood in a vat house at dawn, watching steam rise from 1,000 barrels of fermenting stout. The worker welfare that had defined Guinness for over a century, the housing, the healthcare, the pensions, the beer allowance, the funeral fund, the sense that the brewery was a community was phased out by the end of the 20th century. Diageo's record has been one of efficiency, cost reduction, and shareholder value. The old saying about the womb to the tomb became a memory, then a story, then a line in a museum exhibit at the storehouse. The Netflix show, for all its inventions, gets one thing profoundly right. It understands that wealth does not liberate, it imprisons. Every generation inherits not just the money, but the obligation, not just the mansion, but the maintenance, not just the name, but the expectations that come with it. But the show also reveals, unintentionally, how easy it is to get Ireland wrong from the outside. Irish critics savaged House of Guinness. The Irish Times called James Norton's accent that of a steampunk Mr. Tato, a reference to an Irish crisp mascot. The Irish Independent described the clichés as arriving thick and fast. The Spectator's Liz Walsh pointed out that a Fenian character in the show declares that the Brotherhood wants a united, independent Ireland, an extraordinary blooper, because in 1868 Ireland was a united country, albeit under British rule. The question of partition would not arise for another 50 years. The Fenian characters were dressed in green like Spirit Halloween costumes. The working class Irish were depicted as filthy, violent, and savage. Portrayals that Irish viewers found not merely inaccurate, but offensive, particularly given that these scenes were set only 20 years after the Great Famine. The show earned 89% on Rotten Tomatoes. In Ireland, it was received as stereotypical tosh. The Guinness harp itself tells the story of this contradiction. Adopted as part of the Guinness label in 1862, trademarked in 1876, it is based on the 14th century Brian Boru harp displayed at Trinity College Dublin. A symbol of Irish identity so potent that when the Irish Free State separated from Britain in 1922, it adopted the same emblem as its national symbol. Guinness had to reverse the direction of its harp to distinguish the beer from the state. An Irish symbol, claimed by an Anglo-Irish family, used to sell Irish beer across a British empire to markets that included the colonised nations of Africa and Asia. The layers of irony are thick enough to pour. But where the show reaches for conspiracy and secret lovers and Fenian gunfire, the real story is quieter and more devastating. A family that gave Dublin its parks, its cathedral, its social housing, and its most famous export, and in return absorbed the city's labour, its loyalty, and its dependence for 200 years. Walk through Dublin today and you walk through the Guinness legacy whether you know it or not. St Stephen's Green, where families picnic, was Arthur's gift. St Patrick's Cathedral was saved by Benjamin's money. The Iveagh Trust apartments still house families in the Liberties. Iveagh House hosts Ireland's foreign policy. The Storehouse, with over 20 million visitors since 2000, is the country's most popular tourist attraction. Whether the exchange was fair depends on where you stand, inside the brewery gates or outside them, in the Iveagh Trust apartment, or in the Gravity Bar at the top of the Storehouse, sipping a pint with a panoramic view of a city that one historian has compared to the Medici's Florence. No other family has shaped a European capital so completely, and no Netflix dramatisation, however entertaining, can capture the true weight of what the Guinness name meant to Dublin. Not as melodrama, but as infrastructure, as dependency, as a bargain between a city and a dynasty that lasted longer than most nations. If this story challenged you, surprised you, or made you see the black stuff differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which dynasty, landmark, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.